I'm here with Ashoka Thiagarajan. Ashoka has been with New West Symphony for over a decade.
My mother was very influential to both my brother and me in learning an instrument, starting a classical instrument. I was 3 years old when I started to play the violin, by my mom's choice in a way. I kind of always wanted to learn the cello because in my American vacations I loved the dessert jello, so I thought jello would be a cool thing to learn. But I stuck with the violin, and she influenced us very much. She is a piano teacher, took us to lots of concerts. I saw my first opera in Dortmund. There was Zauberflöte. My father, in the early 60s, was the president of the Indian-German Cultural Society, and was actually very influential in bringing Ravi Shankar to Germany for its first performance in Germany. So my dad had a lot of his records, and they were very accessible, of course, for us to listen to. And my cousin actually is a South Indian Carnatic singer, trained. And through her, I was exposed to that art form from a very young age, just even going to her lessons, seeing how the teacher was going one by one to the students, sitting in a circle, and the teacher was in the middle, and he would teach each phrase, segment by segment of the Vedas and the Ragas, and they would sit there and imitate it. That was the first time I heard Indian Carnatic, classical South Indian music.
How did Indian music influence your compositions?
Obviously, with being to India many times, it has influenced me a lot. So I wanted to always, and I always bring Indian, if it's motifs or if it's just the emotional soundscape of just the noise or the music that I've experienced in India, I always would like to bring that and combine it with my Western cultural upbringing in Germany. Bring Indian elements into, if it's the rhythmical element, or even sometimes trying to stay true to a raga, one of the so-called scales. Actually, the ragas influenced Western classical music in the scale system quite a lot. So I guess that would then be in my compositions also, right? But on then the other hand, I always loved growing up this 80s boy, 90s boy in Germany. Techno was very strong in Germany. So I like to bring this element into my classical writing also.
What traditions passed on from that in the pure form, and what did you modify and made it kind of a SoCal Indian German tradition?
A big modification is definitely in the cuisine.
Tell me more about that.
My wife is a wonderful cook, and my two boys and we are really enjoying her cooking quite a lot. And she brings actually Korean culture into the family. She's Korean. And we have a potpourri of German schnitzel, Indian masala dishes, curries, and then of course bibimbap or some incredible kimchi fried rice or all these different dishes. And the traditions carry over in a very philosophical way of living. I try to teach my boys a lot about the German ways and culture, and then of course also the Indian ways, which sometimes are quite conflicting. They're not always the same. That might present a problem, but then on the other hand, it actually shows the solution on how to navigate between all these cultures. And then you mix my wife's culture, the Korean culture, and there was a very beautiful and deeply rooted culture in Asia, of course, also. And then to try to find an identity in there make me realize that you find your identity within yourself and with all the influences that come within you. It's a bit of a Buddhist approach, I guess. And I teach this or I try to pass that on to my two boys as much as I can. My wife is Christian, so we have all of these cultures come together, and I think there are not many places in the world like Los Angeles where it fits in perfectly, actually.
Good evening, my name is Rahul Neuman.
My name is Shrewsbery.
The sitar, it descends from an instrument called the veena, which is thousands of years old. We don't know exactly how, when it started, but a very, very old instrument. And it can be thought of a little bit as a hybrid of the Indian veena and the Persian sitar, a much smaller instrument. But it is an example of one of these kind of collaborations that evolved over time. In its modern form, the sitar, as you can see, the base is made out of a gourd, so just a dried out pumpkin. They shape the gourd with a whole network of strings, and then the top, the tabla, is all made out of wood. The neck and the rest of this is made out of wood. And then you can see there are quite a few strings. The number of strings varies from sitar to sitar. There's different styles of sitar that use different numbers of strings. This one has about 20 strings. The main ones are held on the main bridge. The smaller bridge that you can see here hold what are called the tarafs. These are sympathetic strings, which basically resonate with each main note that you play on the main string. One of the innovations of the modern sitar, if you can see from this angle, are the curved frets. So that curvature allows us to play a particular technique called meend, which is basically bending from one note to the next. So it's not just going from one note to the next, but everything in between is extremely important in Indian classical music.
Tabla actually comes from an Arabic and Persian word called tabl, and it's the generic word for drum. Tabla was the Indo-language kind of adaptation of that word. Even though it's a modern incarnation, its history is attached to a very old way of dealing with rhythm. And one of those is how we use rhythm as language. So we learn this not by notes on a page, but by singing. So every sound on the drum actually has a corresponding vocal syllable. So na is literally. So if my teacher says, "Oh no, this has na 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 na," I know. Right? Titi. The name of that sound. Tuna. Tak. Na. Tun. Tere tere. Left hand sounds, you have kat. Ga. Ga ga. So just like the sitar, we bend notes. That's one of the features of Indian classical music, be it percussion or anything else. If you can do it with the voice, you should be able to do it on the instrument. So ga ga. Use my wrist to slide. Go up in pitch, ga 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 ga, and then down, ga 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 ga. Combining the sounds, you have dha, din, tidikitata, ta tidikitatakata, datikadikitaginata tiginatindikina, datikadikidendikadikidakidakida, dagadinakadikida, gendrikadikida. And so on. There's just so many combinations. Everything we speak or everything we say, we have to be able to play. And so oftentimes, our teachers will teach us through this language without the drum at all. It's a very interesting part of this drum, tabla, that's been handed down through many other drums in Indian history. Tabla used to just be the background timekeeper. And slowly, the instrumentalists and the melody players started inviting kind of the tabla to say more on stage. Tabla has now become an equal kind of weight on stage, where the sitar player or the instrumental player will play something, and then they look for the tabla player to kind of say something back. And it's a challenging part of this music to be able to be spontaneous with, you know, what you're saying back, and not be out of context. Because tabla is a fast, virtuosic instrument. So many times when tabla players get the chance to say something, they want to say it really fast. But it's not always the way, you know, we should be answering back in musical context. And that's a really fun part of this music, when you see the interaction back and forth between the melody and the rhythmist.
Now we wanted to talk a little bit about raga and tala, starting with raga. Raga is a little bit of an elusive concept, but it is the name of a music piece in Indian classical music. In general, the raga is broken up into two sections, the alap section and the gat section. The first section, called the alap, is characterized by a lot of slow means, which is, again, pulling from one note to the next. So an example of an alap movement. The second subsection of the alap of a performance is called jor. Jor is where a pulse is introduced, not to be confused with a rhythm cycle, just a particular pulse. So here's a quick example of how jor sounds. That builds as you develop along the notes of the particular rag that you're playing. The last subsection of the first part of the performance, the alap, is called jala. Jala is just where you use these chakari strings in this particular manner. Now the second part of the performance, this is called the gat section, and this is where tabla and sitar performs together. The gat section is set to a rhythm cycle, particular rhythm cycle, and within this rhythm cycle you can do a lot of improvising there. A common way to improvise is to use short or longer runs called tam. This note is beat 1, and then from there you count to 16. So that's just a quick example of gat performed between sitar and tabla. And within that gat section, you'll have parts where the tabla is keeping the rhythm cycle. That allows me to improvise, but knowing where I am, so I can come back into the gat at the right section. And similarly, when Miles performs his tabla solo, I will keep that composition, that set composition, so he knows where we are in the rhythm cycle, so he can come back in.
once I got in, I was really fortunate to be involved in studios that really honored, as best they could, the traditional components of yoga, such as incorporating Sanskrit along with English, also chanting, incorporating yoga sutras into the yoga asana classes. So I had a great foundation. And a decade later, after practicing yoga, loving it, I decided to teach. I went through teacher training, got certified, and I started volunteer teaching. And loved that so much that I decided to take a break from my corporate job and teach full-time. And as I have kind of taken a couple steps back and shifted toward more learning, more education, and also advocacy for the appreciation of yoga rather than appropriation. And included in that is learning more about South Asian culture, history, people. So to that point, I'm really grateful and humbled to be here learning about Bharatanatyam today. Here in the US, yoga is known mostly as a fitness class with an enormous industry associated with it. And I was just reading some research findings that Americans spend $16 billion every year on yoga classes, equipment, clothing, and accessories.
Which is so funny because in India, where yoga originated as a form of meditation and prayer, it wasn't done with any equipment or, specialized, clothing or anything like that. It's just a form of like kind of raw meditation and raw prayer. So it's interesting how yoga has taken on almost a life of its own in the US that is a lot different really than what it is in India. But honestly, even as an Indian American, as a dancer, I've learned a lot about Bharatanatyam, but I've learned a lot less about yoga. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the basics of yoga and the different types.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So there's so many, as you know, styles and lineages of yoga. My focus has been on vinyasa, which is referred to as flow here in the States, as well as hatha yoga. And in a typical vinyasa class, we start with meditation and pranayama, which is breath control, breathing exercises. We take some time for everyone to set a personal intention for the class and then move into yoga asana, which is movement and posture. The asana portion usually runs as an arc like fitness classes do. Movements that warm up the body, increase in tapas, the heat and discipline, sometimes culminating in a peak posture, and then concluding with a cool down and ending in shavasana, that final resting and integration position, and then ending with gratitude for the teachings and the practice.
Hi everyone, my name is Arun Mathai. I am a Bharatanatyam dancer.
My name is Kiran Athreya and I'm a Carnatic violinist. I got into Carnatic music from my parents, and my parents got into Carnatic music from their parents. It's a very passed on generation for South Indians to be involved in arts and music. A very important part of Carnatic music is the improvisational aspect of it. In these compositions, there are many areas where the performer, the vocalist or instrumentalist, are able to explore the composition. So prelude to the actual composition is something we call ragam, and we're able to explore the scale and give your own take on the scale. Then you come into the composition, and there are many areas that are embedded into it, such as the netaval portion, where the performer takes a specific line and does his own variation, his or her own variations of the line, and then you come back to the composition. So it's not, it is something that came and written from a long time ago. We sit and we hold the violin here by our foot and up in the neck area.
So it's cradled in your heel.
Correct. And this allows my left hand to be free for any ornamentation or transitions from note to note that is being played. We will play the major scale. This has all the major notes.
Do, re, mi.
Exactly. And so we add various different ornamentations and finger movements to elaborate a little bit more. Our version of the same scale would be.
Shankarabaranam.
Exactly.
There are ragams that are associated with joy and happiness, and those that are a little bit more somber and sad. So I wonder if you might do a quick demonstration just to juxtapose two ragams, maybe one that's a little bit more somber and one that's a little bit happier.
Sure, absolutely. I will demonstrate the ragam Revati, which highlights a lot of the somber notes and emotions that you explained.
Definitely. Beautiful.
Thank you. And for a little bit more uplifting scale, I would suggest something like Bilahari.
Bharatanatyam is a very ancient style of dance from South India, and its origins are believed to date as far back as the 2nd century BCE, sometime between the 2nd century BCE and perhaps the 3rd century CE. And similar to Carnatic music, it was an art form performed as a means of praise, primarily performed in temples, typically in praise of a specific deity, and often as prayer to the deity and not even as a means of entertainment or for the benefit of an audience. And it was a hereditary tradition passed on through many generations, again, primarily performed in temples until about the 17th, 18th century when, with royal patronage, it started to be performed not just in the temples, but also in palaces. And this continued until effectively the British colonial rule, as many colonial powers do, suppressed the indigenous art forms. And so Bharatanatyam, but also many of the other arts, folk classical art forms were sort of suppressed and relegated to the fringes of society and stayed that way until the early 20th century, when there were a number of people who, as part of the independence movement, really wanted to take an active role in reinvigorating the arts, the artistic traditions, because there's so many rich artistic traditions from all over the subcontinent. And so effectively what happened was the dance form itself, which was not known as Bharatanatyam, was not called Bharatanatyam, was adopted, appropriated. You can choose a number of different terms, but effectively it was taken from the hereditary community and propagated effectively on a very wide scale. Some people say it was sort of chastened a little bit, but converted to a point where it could be performed or presented more widely as a performing art. Shivoham was choreographed by a teacher that I've been blessed to study with named Rama Vaidyanathan from Delhi. And it was composed by a really talented flautist named G.S. Rajan. And the piece itself, though primarily abstract in movement, does incorporate elements of storytelling. And what you'll see is there are two specific mudras or hand gestures that I'll be using a lot in the piece. And they're both associated with the Hindu deity Shiva in his form Nataraja, which is the Lord of Dance. And Shiva is traditionally known as the destroyer, but in his form Nataraja, in one of his arms, he holds the mudra Damaru. As the dancer, we hold Damaru, but Shiva himself is holding the drum. And the drum is associated with primordial heartbeat or creation itself, right? But he's Shiva, and Shiva is also associated with destruction. And so in one of his other hands, he holds fire. And as a dancer, we hold the mudra, Alapadma. So you've got Alapadma going as the fire and Damaru going as the drum or the creation. And so what you've got in this piece is the balance of both creation from the drum and destruction from the fire. At the same time as there is this destruction, there's also the hope for creation, right? And I think that's what we're seeing through advocacy and activism and art. Absolutely. Is the ability to overcome destruction.
you.